Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, March 21st, 2025, and our friend Ambassador Chas Freeman is back with us. Welcome back, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you, Dima.
Let's get started with the situation in the Middle East, with the war, with the conflict between the Trump administration and Yemenis. And what's your take on the way that Donald Trump is behaving in the Middle East? Because he has changed a lot since he took power. What is the main reason, in your opinion?
Well, you have to remember that his main donors are ardent Zionists. He's beholden to them. He's basically following the direction of Israel on virtually every issue. I thought for a while that the attacks on Yemen might be a substitute for an attack on Iran. That is to say, he could show that he was supporting Israel against an Iranian client, the Houthis. Houthis, of course, are quite independent in what they do, but they do get support from Iran. And so this is arguably a blow against Iran. The problem with it, of course, there are many problems with it. It's illegal. It is unconstitutional. There is no declaration of war by the United States against Yemen to justify this. But mostly it's ineffectual. It's not as though Yemen hasn't been bombed for 10 years. Yemenis apparently know how to deal with that. And Yemen has been the only country in the region, or indeed anywhere, to stand up completely for the Palestinians as they are subjected to genocide. So Yemen, when Israel appeared to a so-called ceasefire, which of course it violated continually, and which it's now torn up, Yemen suspended its blockade in Red Sea of ships headed to Israel or owned by Israel. It has now resumed it because Israel has resumed the genocide. So Yemen has been very consistent, very brave, very tough, and it has not yielded. And there's no more reason to believe that these attacks by Mr. Trump will have greater success than the attacks by the Biden administration did. So I think this is an expensive and exhausting thing for the U.S. Navy, assisted by the British Navy. And there's some refueling of aircraft, evidently out of Cyprus by the British. But it's not very unlikely to yield anything. The only thing it could possibly yield would be a counterattack in the form of terrorist action against the United States, like 9/11.
Ambassador, when it comes to the main reason of the Israeli government to break the ceasefire, here is what the former Israeli intelligence officer, and he's a journalist as well right now, he said the ceasefire didn't collapse. It was collapsed by the Israeli government. And what is the are they going to convince the public opinion in the United States that Hamas is responsible for what's going on right now between Israel and Hamas, between Israel and Palestinians, or they don't care about the public opinion in the United States?
Well, I think there is much public opinion in the United States that will side with Barak Ravid, the reporter and former intelligence officer, who was very close to Israeli intelligence still, in his statement that this was deliberately done by Mr. Netanyahu. I think people who follow this issue closely understand that Netanyahu needs the war to remain out of jail. Actually, while he used the resumed attack on Gaza as an excuse for not appearing in court against the charges of corruption that he faces. It's very clear also that, as that statement by Barak Ravid said, Netanyahu was very clear from the very beginning that he didn't intend to honor the ceasefire, that he reserved the right to resume a war at any time. Members of his cabinet, especially Mr. Smotrich, made it clear that they had remained in the cabinet only because he had assured them that there would be no extended ceasefire. And now Ben Gvir, who left the cabinet because he didn't trust Netanyahu's assurances that he would restart the war, is back in the cabinet since the war is reestablished. So there are multiple motivations here. The fundamental one, of course, is the same as Zionists have always had, and that is they want to rid Palestine of Palestinians. They want to drive out the Palestinians, or if they can't do that, kill them, so there are no Palestinians in Palestine to impede their settlement of it. You have to add to this the personal motivations of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is hiding behind the war to remain in power. So you have a combination of Zionist objectives and Mr. Netanyahu's personal interests at stake. Israel is very divided on this. The head of Shin Bet has just been fired by Mr. Netanyahu, in part because he doesn't agree with this approach, nor does Mossad, as I understand it, the Foreign Intelligence Agency. Certainly the hostage families are up in arms over this because they correctly judge that, as happened on the first day, this could be fatal to those Israeli hostages who are still alive. One of them apparently was killed in the Israeli bombing in the first day. Meanwhile, you have the Israeli press saying that, well, they killed 400 operatives. Well, 200 of those operatives were children, 100 were women. This has no credibility at all outside Israel. But there is in the United States a heavily pro-Zionist press. The American political elite is essentially in the hands of Zionist campaign donations. And so the answer to your question is that the establishment of the United States will, like the Trump administration, blame Hamas when there's no basis for doing that. Basically, Israel did not keep the ceasefire agreement. It tore it up. It demanded new conditions. Hamas did not accept those. And it's ridiculous to blame Hamas for the breakdown of peace, such as it was in Gaza.
Is Trump turning to be a better help for Netanyahu than Joe Biden?
It seems so, in mainly because it's not apparent that he has any decency at all, any human spirit with regard to the mass murder of Palestinians. Mr. Biden showed evidence that he was concerned. He didn't translate that into opposition to Israel, but he did express concerns. Mr. Trump has no concerns. He wants to redevelop Gaza as a new Riviera on the Mediterranean.
And it seems that Donald Trump asked the Senate for permission to attack Iran. Do you think, you mentioned the situation between the United States and Yemen? You see it as an alarm or some sort of warning to Iran that if we attack Houthis, the next step we're going to attack you. Do you think that he's serious in starting a new war, a new conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I certainly hope not. But again, let's go back to the fact that he seems to be wholly in the pocket of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And Mr. Netanyahu has always wanted to have an American attack on Iran. He spent years trying to encourage or stimulate or provoke such an attack. So we can't be sure. I will say that asking the Senate is not enough. Under the American Constitution, both houses must vote for a war. I'm not sure that he could get those votes. But therefore, he just ignores the Constitution and proceeds as he wishes, or I should say, as Israel wishes. So the American people were promised an America First policy. What we have is an Israel First policy.
By the way, I don't know what's the main objective of negotiation. It's that all about JCPOA, the same sort of negotiation, or he's thinking of something beyond that? Because as long as he tries to humiliate Iran and the way that he's talking to Iranians, he's not going to get that.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I think the supreme national interest of Iran is the preservation of Iran's national identity, which is a composite of the Persian traditions, the great Persian cultural traditions and history, with the Islamic Republic and the Iranian version of Shiism. Iran is not going to allow itself to be bullied. It will be cautious. Of course, it has always shown caution, but it will not allow itself to be coerced into a surrender. So I don't know. I think probably one of the factors at work here is that Iran does continue rapidly to increase its stockpile of enriched uranium. It is not enriched to weapons grade, but just below it, which means that in a matter of weeks, Iran could produce enough weapons grade uranium to build a nuclear weapon, assuming it has done the other engineering studies required, because there's a requirement when building a nuclear weapon for precision engineering of a way of pushing the various masses of uranium together with sufficient speed and force to cause them to begin to fission at a rapid rate, and thereby they basically explode. So the question of whether Iran has done the engineering necessary to accomplish that is something we don't know the answer to. But we do know from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and other sources that the centrifuges which separate higher grade uranium from lower are whirling at great speed all over their clandestine locations in Iran. So this may provide some sense of urgency to the United States, but I think in the end, the motivation here is more to pacify Israel and to follow Israel's desires and to appease donors, Zionist donors, than it is any specific objective with respect to Iran. Israel wants regime change in Iran. It wants to humiliate Iran. It wants to do to Iran what it has done to Syria. I don't think the United States agrees with that. I think there would be quite a bit of opposition, by the way, from the American military to any order to attack Iran. But I suspect in the end they'd obey orders and do so. So this is a dangerous moment.
You've mentioned about this situation between Israelis and Hamas. Do we know what was at least the reason that the Israeli government is talking about? It seems that they have planned in a ceasefire in 3 phases, in step by step releasing or exchanging the hostages. But Israel didn't want the second phase. They wanted to exchange all the hostages in the first phase. Was that the change that they were asking for? That's why they...
Well, basically, they were asking for phase 1 to be indefinitely continued and for all of the hostages to be released all at once. In other words, stages 2 and 3 would not occur. They would not withdraw from Gaza. They would continue to occupy the Philadelphia corridor on the border with Egypt. They would not proceed to a negotiation of a peace. And here it's very interesting. The Trump administration authorized an envoy to speak directly with Hamas, which he did. By the way, if you want to understand the other party to actually negotiate a deal, you have to meet with them. You have to listen to them. He did. He reported that Hamas was prepared to withdraw from, give up its weapons and withdraw from politics in Gaza. In other words, its cause is Palestinian nationalism, not its own advancement. He said he found the people he talked with reasonable. He was confident there could be a deal reached with them. This horrified Mr. Netanyahu and others because they don't want any American direct understanding of Hamas. They want to continue to be the source of all information, or I should say disinformation, on what Hamas's positions on matters are. And they don't want the United States directly ascertaining those positions from Hamas. Of course, their position is one should never negotiate with Hamas, even though they do negotiate with Hamas. So they're very contradictory. But this has caused great alarm. Mr. Trump's, I think, very intelligent authorization of this direct contact with Hamas has caused great consternation in the Israeli establishment. I think the special envoy concerned has been sidelined.
We had the Egyptian plan, peace plan for Gaza, and right now it seems that all of these Arab states are so silent about what's going on. They're not. You don't see any sort of substantial voice on their part to talk against what's going on. Do you think that they're gonna let it happen? Just silent, keep it somehow the way it is right now, or they're gonna change their attitude?
I don't see any prospect that they will change their attitude. So far, they've been entirely passive. The Egyptian plan for Gaza, basically ignores the fact that Israel is not going to let the Arab states have any role in controlling Gaza. By the way, the Egyptian plan also calls for the Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, to return to Gaza and play a role. People in Gaza don't want that. The last election that was held was won by Hamas, not by the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, which runs that establishment. Palestinians regard the Palestinian Authority essentially as a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation and part of the mechanism of oppression from which they suffer. There's no evidence that anyone in Gaza would be prepared to accept their return, whatever their feelings may be about Hamas. So this is a one-sided kind of proposal. It's no more credible than Mr. Trump's Riviera in Gaza proposal is. The one thing they all have in common is the Egyptian proposal plan rests on retaining the Palestinian presence in Gaza and then using Palestinian labor. But the Israelis are determined to exterminate the Palestinians, and the United States is apparently backing them without any question in this war of annihilation. It's never really been a war. It's an extermination campaign. Needs to be seen for what it is. But I have to tell you, the American media continue to misportray it.
Turkey. Right now, it seems that the situation is getting unstable and Erdogan is not in a good position. Is that related to what's going on in Syria? Who are these opposition to Erdogan? Are they going to offer something better for Turkey, for the region, or they're going to be more in line with the Israelis?
No, I don't think they're in line with the Israelis at all. I think Mr. Erdogan's problems are mainly domestic, and he's shown an authoritarian and autocratic approach to Turkish politics, which many Turks don't like and which they oppose. Now he's arrested his main opposition, and unfortunately, there was a lot of progress in Turkish politics toward democracy. That has been progressively reversed. You remember the so-called coup attempt by Fethullah Gulen and the Gulenist movement, supposedly, um, and the oppression that followed that. I suppose, Mr. Erdogan has accomplished a few things. He has persuaded Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish leader, to give up the armed struggle. He's clearly been instrumental in trying to bring the Kurds in Syria into alignment with the government in Damascus. But no, it's an uncertain situation, and I think your characterization is correct. There's a good deal of instability in Turkey now.
Europeans, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, even with the Trump administration in Washington, they're trying to do their best in order to fight the Trump administration in Ukraine. But you don't see their important role in the Middle East. You don't hear from them what would be their policy in the Middle East. They don't. It doesn't seem that they're interested in participating in what's going on in the Middle East.
I think that's right. And this is an illustration of the irrelevance of the collective West to the Middle East. There isn't really a collective West. The United States and the United Kingdom are together in backing Israel's genocide. The others sit on their hands while wringing them. They complain, but they do nothing. Some actually support the genocide. If you look at Mr. Orban in Hungary, I think that's his position. The Germans remain paralyzed by their own guilt for conducting a similar genocide, and are determined not to break not to have any light between themselves and the Israelis. But in the Ukraine context, the key thing is the Europeans have no peace plan. They have nothing to offer in the negotiations. What they are offering is boots on the ground in Ukraine. They don't have enough soldiers to make that significant. And in any event, the entire reason the war began was because Russia would not tolerate a Western European NATO presence or an American presence on its doorstep in Ukraine. So the Russians have made it abundantly clear from the very beginning that if there is any peacekeeping force required in Ukraine, and of course there is no peace in Ukraine, so all of this is hypothetical at the moment. When and if there is a peace, it would have to be enforced by people other than NATO members, meaning probably troops drawn from the global south. Much of UN peacekeeping efforts, in fact, are staffed by people from Fiji, Ghana, and other countries in the global south. The Chinese too, but I doubt that Ukraine or NATO would accept China in Ukraine. So Europeans remain divided, hypocritical. Double standards are being applied. They accuse the Russians of atrocities, but they don't raise any charges against Israel for far worse atrocities. They don't enforce the World Court or Criminal Court, International Criminal Court decisions or warrants. They ignore them. And this, of course, totally discredits the West as a global leader, because the West is repudiating the very norms that it said made it the natural global leader. So much for human rights, so much for the Genocide Convention, so much for the laws of war, so much for even-handedness, so much for honesty. None of these things are being honored.
Financial Times reported that European military powers work on 5 to 10-year plan to replace the United States in NATO. Do they really not see what has happened during the conflict in Ukraine? Because the way that they're thinking of building up their military, that's not going to help them in a long run. That's not going to save them from what's going on right now. in the world, a bigger picture of what's going on. How possible is that for the European leader to go in that direction?
Well, the Europeans, if they get there, they get united. If they put themselves together, if they restructure the European Union to be more effective, will have no trouble developing a considerable military force over the course of, as you said, 5-10 years, and that is something that most Americans would welcome. But the real issue, of course, is not perpetuating the military division of Europe or the military confrontation that has resulted in war in Ukraine. The real issue is how to develop a political solution to Europe's security issues such that defense spending both in Russia and in the rest of Europe can be modest and moderate, while both feel secure. And the Europeans do not have to depend on the United States as they have for the last 80 years. So it's a good development that the Germans and others are greatly increasing defense spending and trying to take charge of their own destiny. It will take them 5 to 10 years to achieve very much of anything. But it really isn't the major issue. The major issue is, what is the security architecture in Europe? What are the understandings under the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the United Nations, or both, involving Russia and NATO? What are the parameters of a stable peace in Europe? Ukraine, as a neutral country, would be at the center of this. But mere Ukrainian neutrality is not enough. There have to be further understandings and a broader agreement. And we're nowhere near that. As I said, there is no peace in Ukraine. There's not even a ceasefire. There are one-sided offers of ceasefires, first from Mr. Zelensky, under the prodding of the United States, second from Mr. Putin, again with as a result of the United States conducting a dialogue with him. But these ceasefire proposals don't match. Zelensky proposes a stand down on Russian attack on not just on energy infrastructure, which Mr. Putin is prepared to agree to, but on ports and railroads and other infrastructure. And Mr. Putin, for his part, is not prepared to accept continuing long-range strikes by Ukraine at facilities in his own country. So there are offers, partial ceasefires. The partial ceasefires don't match. There is no ceasefire. And it's hardly surprising in these circumstances that long-range strikes by both sides continue. The final point here is that, of course, the incentives for the Russians to agree to a ceasefire are much less than those for Ukraine. Ukraine is losing the war. Ukraine is losing territory. Ukraine is run out of military manpower. Ukraine is depopulated. It's deindustrialized. It's weakened. Its democracy has disappeared. Its corruption continues to flourish. Russia is gaining ground, not losing it. And while Russia may, like Ukraine, have a system which is heavy on financial oligarchs and most unjust in terms of income distribution, with the top 1% skimming off vastly too much of the wealth, Russia is not on the ropes like Ukraine. And if the war continues, it will simply continue to take more territory, kill more Ukrainians, and it can absorb the losses on its own side. So a ceasefire is not something the Russians want in and of itself. What they want is a peace. And a ceasefire as part of a peace, they have said, is entirely acceptable. But at the moment, there's no agreement on what a peace or European security architecture would look like. And there's no agreement that Ukraine will be neutral, by Ukraine anyway.
Do you think that Russia is interested in the aftermath of a Ukrainian settlement, is interested in dividing the western part of Ukraine in various ethnicities, or that would be a danger for them in terms of Romanians, for example, they can put weapons in that part and they can
So
come
I
back?
think they want a general rollback of forward deployed weapons against them. Some elements of this are obviously negotiable. That is to say, but I don't think the neutrality of Ukraine and the disarming of Ukraine in terms of foreign hostile forces on Ukrainian territory is negotiable. The level of armed force that Ukraine might maintain is something that might be negotiated, but it's not going to involve foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. The Romanians, of course, are divided. You mentioned the Romanians. We've seen an election in Romania disallowed by the European Union, basically, through a court in Romania. So much for democracy. That is not a democratic approach. And so the damage that this conflict is doing, well, both conflicts, the one in Gaza is essentially has made American Zionists the most formidable enemies of our Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom from search and seizure, freedom from arbitrary actions by the government, a matter of the past. I mean, we have lost a great deal of our freedoms to pressure from the Zionist lobby. And I would say the corrosive effects of the Ukraine war in Europe in particular are evidenced by what just happened in Romania. Neither war is compatible with the kind of constitutional democracy that the West wants to stand for. So Mr. Trump is absolutely right. These wars should end. His answer for the war to end in Palestine is for the Palestinians to be annihilated. His answer in Ukraine is uncertain, but it does not involve the entry of Ukraine into NATO. It does not involve Ukraine recovering those territories, Crimea and the four eastern oblasts, that Russia has taken in whole or in part from Russia. And this is all very murky and unclear. I guess I will end by saying my own view is that Mr. Trump has an idea of a broad rapprochement and cooperation with Russia. And Ukraine is a sideshow in this context. It's a means to that end. It's not an end in itself. And so he's quite prepared to sacrifice Ukraine in the broader interest, the strategic interest of the United States in geopolitical and economic cooperation with a resource-rich Russia. I think he may be prepared to do the same with China. He may have some sort of idea of global order based on G3 or G4, maybe other countries, great powers running the world. This is not really novel. This is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Stalin had in mind, and Churchill after World War II. They included the French out of courtesy, and because the French had an empire in Africa and elsewhere. But basically, that concept was great powers running the world. Now, if this concept were applied, there'd probably be a few more, and maybe certainly India, I would think, and possibly Brazil, certainly maybe Japan, but maybe a group of countries, Arab League or African Union or something. And nobody knows, but I think Mr. Trump has in mind a fundamental reordering of global affairs to empower the great powers. And this means that a smaller country like Ukraine is a pawn on the chessboard.
Would that influence the policy of the United States toward Iran, that he may get influenced by Xi or Vladimir Putin? They both are interested in what's going on in the Middle East. They know the security of the Middle East is so important, at least for China somehow economically, and for Russia in terms of their security.
Well, the posture on Iran is quite confused, as I indicated earlier, in a sense. First, Mr. Trump seemed to be very interested in a Russian mediation between the United States and Iran. That doesn't seem to be getting pursued at the moment. Now he's threatening an attack on Iran, an escalation of the attack on the Houthis, whom he regards as agents of Iran, which is not accurate, but that is the perception. He's also, we hear people in his cabinet saying that if Iran strengthens its relationship with China, that will not be acceptable, and so on. So on the one hand, we have Mr. Trump apparently recognizing the utility of a direct cooperative relationship with Iran, and on the other hand, joining with Israel in threatening Iran and its independence and the nature and the constitutional order in Iran, which, you don't have to like it. It is what it is. But it's up to Iranians to decide how Iran should be run, not up to people in Washington or London or anywhere else. So I don't know. Everything is in motion at the moment. And I've often said that it is like the kaleidoscope, the tube with the colored glass in it that you turn and the pattern rearranges itself instantly, unpredictably. You can't predict what the pattern will be. It's an example of chaos theory in action. So the world is a bit like that at the moment.
Donald Trump talked with Zelensky. The delegation of the United States talked with talk with Ukraine and Saudi Arabia. They agreed on somehow a ceasefire. They were talking about no attack from the air and from the sea. And then they talked with Russians, and they were in the process of negotiation, talking. And right after that, Ukrainians attacked Russia. The question is, who's running the show in Ukraine? Is somehow the Trump administration, while negotiating, go and fight in Russia and making your position even better? Or it's not the Trump administration, it's the, I don't know, United Kingdom or somehow some European countries that are doing this with Ukraine?
I don't think the Trump administration is duplicitous in this. I don't think they are basically cheating. I think what's happened is there have been two separate negotiations, one with Ukraine, one with Russia, that produced incompatible results. Russia would very much like to have a halt to attacks on its fleet in the Black Sea, for example. It's not clear to me that Ukraine is prepared to do that. It's easy for the Russians to agree to suspend attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine because the winter is almost over, and the impact of such attacks is much less apparent, much less effective than it was during the coldest part of the winter, which is now past us. So we have an agreement between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump via intermediaries, which is basically a ceasefire between Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky, not between Zelensky and Putin. We have an agreement between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, reached both through intermediaries and a direct telephone call conversation of 2 hours, which has put forward a separate concept of ceasefire. Putin and Zelensky are not talking to each other. Zelensky has historically taken the position he won't negotiate with Putin or any Russian. Mr. Putin has said until Mr. Zelensky has a constitutional mandate, he won't negotiate with him. The only good thing that has happened is, at least in theory, Mr. Zelensky's now agreed to negotiate, but he isn't negotiating. And in fact, he's continuing the diatribe and accusations against Mr. Putin and the Russians that he has always carried out. And Mr. Putin is not interested in negotiating with Mr. Zelensky very much when Mr. Zelensky's in retreat. His relationship with the United States is uncertain. Mr. Zelensky does not have a constitutionally legitimate hold on the presidency in Ukraine. It's apparent that Ukraine is divided between people who are much more realistic than Mr. Zelensky, General Zelensky, for example. And so what we have is foreplay, not the actual consummation of negotiations.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today.
Well, it was a pleasure.
Great pleasure as always.